As it turns out, wood is a great dance partner. It's both moving and grooving. Hey y'all, I am James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today I want to talk about wood movement, that mysterious magical thing that happens with this natural substance called lumber. And this is something that is kind of mysterious to some people, and I want to kind of put that to bed and show you that once you understand what causes it and how it happens and how it forms in the wood, you can easily work around it and figure out what is going to happen in the future with it. So I want to actually go and look at the log itself and see how does it move in the tree, and then that will translate into lumber, and then we'll actually talk about some of the joints and things that can cause problems when you're putting this wood together. So let's jump in and take a look at the log. So here I have a block of box elder. This has been drying in my backyard for about 4 years, and then I brought it inside and it's been drying in here for about 2 years. So it's fairly stable, but this will actually give a good representation of what happens to wood. Now, as a tree grows, it doesn't expand and contract as much vertically. As a matter of fact, you don't actually see trees expanding in the summer and contracting in the winter. There is a little bit of movement, but not much. And really, in the scale of what most people build with lumber, you're never going to measure its length measurement movement. So when you have a board that comes out of the tree, the wood doesn't really move in line with the grain. So the board is not going to get longer and contract. With most of the measuring equipment you're going to have in your shop, you're not going to be able to measure the movement it has with the grain. But there's two other directions in a log. Number one, you have from the center of the tree out towards the outside in a radial pattern. Now, it doesn't expand and contract that much in that space. It does a little bit, but not much at all, to the point where that is considered fairly stable, unless you have a very large tree where you're able to take out like a 30-inch piece from the center to the outside. You're not going to be seeing that much movement from the inside to the outside. Now, where you are going to see it is with the rings. Each of the rings like to expand and contract. And as there are fewer rings in the middle, there is less material in the middle that can absorb and discharge water. Whereas if you get farther and farther out from the middle, you're going to have more material that can absorb and contract. And when you get all the way out at the outside, you can have a lot of movement. So the diameter of this is actually going to want to become larger and smaller. So its movement is going to be in the log's diameter trying to get bigger and smaller. Now, because this is solid, what happens is because when this dries, the middle here isn't going to change that much because there isn't that much water to move. So there really aren't going to be that much that it wants to get smaller. Whereas if you move out farther, it's going to want to get smaller a lot more than it is in the middle. You move all the way out the outside, it's going to want to get smaller even more. And that's why you have these massive cracks. And the cracks are because this is trying to become smaller as it contracts, as it loses moisture. This outside ring wants to become smaller, so its diameter wants to become smaller, but it can't because everything in the middle isn't going to become any smaller. So it's actually kind of cracking in on itself. So if you take a board out of this, and if the board comes from the middle to the outside like this, and you can actually stack up a bunch of boards and have them all coming out of the middle at radial angles, this board is not going to expand and contract that much in this distance. So this board isn't going to want to move that much. It's going to be fairly stable. We would refer that as a quarter sawn board, or also as a riven board, if you were to split it out of the log, which I'd like to do a video on riving lumber out of logs here soon. But this is going to be a very stable board. It's not going to want to expand and contract lengthwise. Its expansion and contraction is going to be in the thinner part of the board, and because there's less material there, it's not going to expand and contract much at all. But the problem with that is most lumber is flat sawn. And so what they do is they take all of these boards out and they basically just stack them up on the log. And so that if you have one board coming out here, it is going to want to expand and contract a lot here because this is actually running very close to along the lines of the rings in the wood. So you're going to have expansion and contraction fairly heavy in this direction, but not much at all in the thinner plane of the wood. So your board is going to want to become wider and thinner depending upon when it is in the year. So what actually causes the expansion and contraction of the wood? Now you see how this is really dry and becomes very cracked. If this were to be taken back to its original moisture level, it would no longer be cracked. Those cracks would seal back up. And so what happens is, if you imagine this to be a whole bunch of straws running lengthwise in the lumber, all of those straws, when they take on water, are going to expand, and the straw size is actually going to become larger, and they all push against each other, becoming bigger. And then when it's drier out, it's going to discharge all that water, and all those straws are going to shrink back down and become smaller. So what happens is, when there's a difference in moisture level in the air, those straws expand and contract, or what we call wood movement. If you are outside and you have the wild movement of nature, you in the winter would have almost, well, in some cases, 0% moisture in the air. And that wood is going to be discharging all of its moisture, getting down to as close to zero as it can, as it's trying to find an equilibrium with the weather. And so that board is going to shrink and shrink and shrink in the winter. But then you get in a hot, humid summer, and the moisture content in the air is 90%, 100%, that wood is going to be absorbing on a lot of moisture and is going to start expanding. And so if you think about it in seasons, the expansion and contraction of wood becomes fairly regular. And if you think about it in terms of expansion and contraction as opposed to just general wood movement, you start to see what is going to cause a problem with. So if you're in a house with a lot of air conditioning, you may find that your wood really doesn't move that much because you have a fairly regular moisture content in your house, so it's not going to move that much from season to season. But if you do have a large moisture movement, particularly if you're in a moist environment that has several seasons, you'll find that that wood will expand and contract a lot. Especially if you do anything with outdoor furniture, you will see a wide movement of expansion and contraction. So you got to kind of plan that into it. If it is a moist time of the year, your boards are going to be bigger. If it's a dry time of year, your boards are going to be smaller. So just one of those things to think about. So let's take a look at some of the joints and what we can do to mitigate that wood movement. So on your average board, it's going to be expanding and contracting in its width, particularly because it's flat sawn. Unless you get close to the middle where it's a quarter sawn board, which in case your expansion contraction will be the thinner space. Also because it is a thinner measurement here, there's less material to expand and contract, therefore there will be less movement in the thinner section of the board. But on your regular flat sawn board, you can expect it to expand and contract the most across the width of the board. And that comes into when we make a lot of carcass joinery, like in the sides of a drawer. If we put these boards together and were to dovetail them together, both of these are going to want to expand and contract at the same pace in the same way. So you'll actually see movement as both of these grow taller and thinner. So if you're making a piston fit drawer in the middle of the winter, you want to leave a little bit of a gap at the top so that the drawer can expand. Otherwise, come summer when everything expands, it's going to swell up and become tight in that drawer. Whereas if you make it in the summer, you're probably going to want to keep it fairly close to tight so that in the winter, when it loses all of its moisture and shrinks, there isn't going to be a large gap at the top of the drawer. And so with dovetails or finger joints, there really isn't a whole lot of problem with wood movement because they're moving together. They're moving in the same direction up and down. Now, if I were to take a board like this and I were to put a tenon from this board into a mortise in this board is going to want to expand and contract this way. But this board, because it's running with the grain, is not going to expand and contract. So this board is not going to move anywhere this way, but this board will want to expand and contract in that space. So if this is a very wide board and a very tight groove, and you fit it very, very tight in the winter, come summer, it may want to bust out. And if there's a very little material left here on the side, it may actually bust out the end grain here as this wants to expand in the middle of the summer. Or you make it in the summer and it's a nice tight fit, but then the winter comes along, you might actually get a shrinkage, and that will then become loose and work its way out. Now on a thin board like this, that it's only 3.5 inches wide, the movement really isn't going to be that much. And in most cases, the measurement on it is going to be, 30 second or less of movement, and the wood movement can handle that. But what happens when you start making a tabletop and your board starts to get 18 inches, 24 inches, 36 inches wide. Well, suddenly you have this large space where the movement can occur, and you can have a large amount of movement across the tabletop. 24 inches across, you might have wood movement that is an 1/8 inch or more. If you're outside on some of those larger tables, you might have up to a 1/4 inch of movement one way or the other. So what we do is we put a breadboard on the end. The breadboard stops the boards from warping and twisting this way. But if we have all of these tenons running in and they're all nice and tight, then all of those tenons are going to want to expand and contract and bust. And so they're either going to break the tenon or they're going to break out the end of the board that they're in. So for a breadboard, we glue the center tenon that comes through. But all the other tenons, we make the mortises bigger so that the tenon can move around inside. Or if we put a pin through, we make the hole in the tenon so that the pin movement can be handled. And as it gets farther out from the middle, that space becomes larger, so it allows for more movement the farther out from the middle it becomes. Also, if you were to be doing a dado, so if you were putting the board in this way, you start running into problems if it's a tight dado, particularly on like a bookshelf, where you might have an 18-inch deep bookshelf. If you dado it into a board and it's a stopped dado, come summer you might end up busting out the piece left on the back. So you want to be thinking about that space fitting in there. Also with wood, if it can't expand in the space, it might actually crush the fibers and break down the fibers in the wood. So as it expands in the summer, it will break all those fibers, and then when it shrinks in the winter, it'll become even smaller, and that might lead to a joint becoming weaker. You may have seen that if you work with axe heads. If the axe head gets wet, the wood inside the axe head will expand and make that a really nice tight joint until it dries out. And as it dries out, it'll become even weaker because all those fibers have been crushed and they become smaller inside the hole, and the axe head might actually come off. Wood movement itself is not a wild and weird thing as people kind of make it out to be. Wood doesn't just, wildly move. It expands and contracts rather regularly, and it's something you can kind of understand and see coming and be able to plan for and work around it. It is not this magical thing that happens when you work with wood, but a simple fact of nature that you can figure out. And if you understand how it fits into the tree and what actually the movement is, you can very easily plan around it, and it becomes far less mystical and magical. There are several resources out there on actually figuring out how much wood is going to move, and it changes species to species and what the percentages of moisture are in your area. But there's a website I'll leave below that you can actually go to, and it will tell you exactly how much the wood is going to move once you plug in its dimensions and the type of wood and some of the other characteristics. And it'll say, this board is going to move a 1/16 of an inch, and so you can kind of plan that into your into your use. There's also a couple apps out there, and I'll leave a few of the favorite ones of mine down below. So I hope you like this video. It has been a very simple one, and one that I kind of like. Wood movement is something that I find to be just kind of fun. It's one of the things about working with a natural substance that makes it enjoyable. If you did like this video, please hit like and go ahead and smash that subscribe button. I do want to say an incredible thank you to the patrons on Patreon. Wood Nerd is the one who suggested this, and he is a patron over on Patreon. If you want to find out more about that, you can find the link right down over here. Also, if you like this video, feel free to check out one of my others. You might find something you like there. And until next time, have a wonderful day.